Hello and welcome back to the channel. On today's tutorial, I'm going to be sharing with you how to draft an asymmetric Victorian corset dress. So if it's your first time viewing my channel, please hit on the subscribe button. Let's dive right into today's video. So now here is the pattern, and I've gone ahead to mark my shoulder to bust, shoulder to under bust, shoulder to waistline, and the top length I'm using is 23. So for the back length and the front length is not the same. I'm using a bust dart. My front length is 23 and my back length is minus 1.5 inches, making it 21 inches, 21 and a half inches. Now I'll go ahead to mark my shoulder divided by 2, and I'll be adding half because this dress has a teacup sleeve, and that will be 7.5 inches. So for the neckline, I'll be making use of 3 by 3.5 inches. So now I'll go ahead and come down by 1 inches at this point, which is my shoulder divided by 2 plus half inch. And after going down by 1 inch, I'm going to go ahead to connect it to the neckline. So after connecting it to the neckline, I'm going to mark out my chest line. To get your chest line is your bust circumference divided by 6 plus 1.5 inches. And I'm going to measure whatever I have there, and I will rule a straight line for my chest line. After that, I'm going to go ahead to measure what I have on the shoulder, which is 7.5 inches. And I'll also make a point there and then place my ruler and connect, drawing a straight line. So I'm going to divide my my armhole into 2, and I'll come in by half. From this point, I'm going to place my tape and I'm going to mark my bust circumference divided by 4, which is 8.3, and I'm going to connect my French curve, place it, connect to the half inch and take it up to the shoulder. Now the next thing I'll do is just to go ahead to outline the shoulder part, and I'll also outline the armhole area of this dress. So after I'm done outlining it, the next step I'm going to take is to go ahead to mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2. My nipple to nipple is 7 inches divided by 2. I have 3.5. Go ahead and mark it at your chest line, bust line, under bust, and top length. This is just to have a straight line. And I'm going to go ahead to place my ruler, and I'm going to connect and draw out a straight line at this point. After I'm done drawing out a straight line, I will divide my shoulder into 2. This is to serve as a guide when I'm drawing out my curve at the upper part or my dart intake at the upper part of my pattern. Now I'll be marking my dart intake at 1 inch at both sides of my under bust, and I'll repeat it at my waistline. Go ahead to place my ruler and I'm going to draw out a straight line. Then I'm going to connect it down to my top length this way. So after doing that, go ahead to outline your dart intake so that it's going to be very visible. So after I'm done outlining this, I want to go ahead to place my French curve, touching my bust down to my under bust, and I will draw it out. Repeat the same process for the other side, and this is what I have. And I'll go ahead to use my French curve also to draw it out. So next, I'm going to place my French curve and I'm going to connect it. So before I reach this point, I'll be marking like 1 inch from the chest line and I'm going to connect. After ruling out this, I'm just going to outline it very well with my marker so that it will be very visible. So after drawing out this line, the next step I'm going to take is to go ahead and I'll mark half inch on this part. I'll be using half inch dart intake because so that when I'm joining it, I won't have much curve. So I'm just going to place my French curve, connect, and I'm going to draw out. After I'm done drawing out, the next step is to go ahead to use my marker and I'm going to outline it this way. So this is what I have at this point. I'll blend it in so that in case when I'm joining my pattern is going to meet. So I found out that it's not meeting. I went up and I blended it into my pattern. So after doing this, the next step I'm going to take is to go ahead to mark the sleeve part of this dress. So I'll be marking 1.75 inches at this point. You can also use 2 inches, which is almost the same thing, and I'll also mark the same 1.75 inches and I'll connect it this way. So now I'll be marking out 0.25 inches from this point because you want to take out the bulginess at the sleeve, and so that by the time you sew the dress, it will be fitted at the shoulder. You won't have your sleeve falling off from the shoulder. So after doing this, the next step I want to take is to go ahead to insert my body circumference. I'm going to mark my bust circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to go ahead to measure this 1 inch I have here, replace it, mark my under bust circumference divided by 4, mark the dart intake, I will replace and add my sewing allowance. At the waistline, I'm going to snatch it, and the fastest way to do that is just to minus 2 inches away from it. I have 28 inches minus 2 inches, that's 26. I will divide it, measure the dart intake, and mark my sewing allowance. At the hip point, I'll mark my hip circumference divided by 4 and add my sewing allowance because there's no dart there. So the next step is just to go ahead to connect my pattern. So after drawing this out, I'm just going to go ahead to use my marker to draw out my line so that it's going to be very visible. Next, I'll place my tape, come up by 2.5 inches, and I'm going to connect it down to the lower part of my pattern this way. So after I'm done doing that, I'm just going to draw out the waistline. So also remember that at the lower part of this dress, there's like a pointy edge, and we'll be working on that. So next, I'll mark 1.5 inches at this point. This is to mark my bust dart. So everybody's bust dart is not the same. That is the difference between your front and your back measurement, because you have a bust at the front and no bust at the back. So I'll extend it down to my bust line, and this is what I have at this point. So I'll go ahead and I will shade it out. So next, I'm going to divide what I have here into 2 because this is a Victorian corset and you want to go ahead and add more darts or split your pattern. So I'm just going to outline this. So you can also add a dart to this and then add it back to your pattern by the side, but to make it more simple and easy, I'm going to be leaving it straight this way. So next, I'll go ahead and measure 1 inch and I'm going to slant it down and I will connect. So next, I'm going to go ahead to blend it out. That is to form the pointy edge we have at the lower part. So next, I'm just going to go ahead to cut my pattern, and if you have any question, please leave your question at the comment section. And at this point, if you haven't yet subscribed, please hit on the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. So I'll go ahead to slit this and I'll cover my bust dart. So after that, I'll continue cutting out my pattern. So after I'm done cutting out my pattern, this is what I have. The next step you want to take is to go ahead and slit the other pattern into 2. And I'll go ahead to trace this out. So this is what I have. So I went ahead to cut this out. So when I was cutting it, actually, I didn't know that my camera wasn't recording. So next, we'll be moving to the back pattern of this dress. So over to the back pattern, I've marked out my basic measurement just like we did in front, and I didn't add zipper to this because you're not going to be using zipper for this particular dress. The neckline I use is 3 by 2 inches. So next, I'll be marking my nipple to nipple divided by 2, and I'll mark it at the bust, at the under bust, and at the waistline, and also mark it at the waist, the top length, sorry. So remember, the length for the back is shorter than the length in the front, and I'm using 21.5 inches. So I'll place my ruler and I'll go ahead to rule a straight line. After doing that, I'm going to go ahead to mark my dart intake. I'll mark 1/2 inch at one side of the waistline and I'll mark 1/2 inch at the other part. So after doing that, I'm going to go ahead to rule my dart or draw out my dart. Place your ruler, connect it upwards, place your ruler and connect to the other side, then connect it to the lower part, and I'll also repeat it at this side. So after I'm done doing that, I'll go ahead to use my marker to outline it so that it's going to be very visible for you to see. So after I'm done doing this, the next step I want to take is to go ahead to mark my body circumference. At the bust, I'm going to mark the bust circumference divided by 4, mark my sewing allowance because there's no dart. At the under bust, I'll mark the under bust circumference divided by 4, measure this dart intake, replace it, and at the waistline, remember we minus 2 inches from the original waistline, so divide that into 2, mark the dart intake and mark your sewing allowance. At the hip line, I'll mark my hip circumference divided by 4, and I'll go ahead to connect my pattern this way. And after doing that, now I'm going to outline my pattern, and this is what I have. So after doing this also, I'm going to draw out my chest line at the back, and while doing that, I'll go up a little at the chest line. So now I'm going to measure the same 1.75 inches, just like I said, you can use 2 inches, and I'll repeat it at the lower part, connect from that point down to the chest line. So now I'm just going to connect and get rid of 0.2.5 inches at that point. Now at the back, you want to create your lacing bar. I'm using 1.5 inches. I don't want to really have a space at the back, but if you want yours to be more, go ahead and do that. You can use 2.5 inches or 3, and I'll go ahead to draw a straight line at that point. After doing that, I'll be making a dot to indicate that that is the lacing bar of the dress. So at this point, I measured 2.5 inches just like we did in front, and I'm going to connect to the back. So after I'm done connecting, I'm going to divide the back pattern also, just to create that Victorian corset effect at the back. You can add a dart to it and replace it to the side, but to make it easy, I'm not adding a dart to it. So I will label my pattern, and after that I'll go ahead to cut this out. So after I'm done cutting out my pattern, this is what I have. This is what my dress is looking like. So after I'm done cutting this, we'll be moving over to the skirt pattern, and for the length of the skirt, I'm using 18 inches, adding 2 inches for folding allowance. That will be 20 inches. So I'll mark my 20 inches and I'll go up by 2 inches, making it the skirt length and also the folding allowance. So after I'm done doing that, the next step is to go ahead and mark 7 inches, which is my hip point. So if you're folding with a fabric, you're going to fold with your hip circumference divided by 4 plus your sewing allowance. Now I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4, and I'll be adding 1 inch for my darts. That is, if you're not using a dart, go ahead and not mark that. So I'll add my sewing allowance. At the hip, I'll mark the hip circumference divided by 4 and add my sewing allowance. At the skirt length, whatever I have at my hip, I'll be minusing 2 inches. So this is to give the dress a fitted effect. Now I'll connect from the waist down to the hip, and from the hip I'll be connecting down to the skirt length, and from there to the folding allowance. After I'm done connecting, I'm going to go ahead to outline my pattern to make it more visible. The next step is to go ahead to mark my dart intake. I'm going to mark about 6 inches, mark ½ inch by both sides, and I'll draw out my dart intake. After drawing it out, I'm going to use my marker to outline it to make it more visible. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to cut out my skirt pattern. So to cut out the back pattern for this, you're going to add a zipper allowance to the front when you're cutting your dress, and remember the front pattern is on fold. So with this, we have come to the end of today's tutorial. Please don't forget to hit on the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and see you in our next video. Thanks.